Two saturation divers were doing their job 485 feet below the surface, and after working for a while, one of them happened to look up towards the diving bell. The diving bell was hanging at an angle and something looked seriously wrong. This was because the bell had become completely disconnected from the lift wire. It was hanging at an angle because it was now being supported only by the umbilical cord and nothing else. The umbilical cord that supplied the heat to their suits, the power supply and communication to everyone above, and most importantly, the breathing gas that was keeping them alive. This is the story of the Wildrake diving accident. Our setting takes place in the North Sea of Scotland, between July and August of 1979. This is the Wildrake. It's a diving support ship with a built-in saturation diving system. It's equipped with a detachable diving bell and it has a decompression chamber on board. For those that aren't familiar with saturation diving, divers will be put into a chamber for several days which slowly increases in pressure. This process also saturates their tissues with the breathing gases they'll be inhaling, and it prepares their body's pressure for the depth that they'll essentially be living in for the next 28 days. 28 days being the standard length for saturation dives. Once their tissues are fully saturated, and once their chamber reaches the same pressure as the depth that they'll be working at, their bodies will now be properly acclimated to the environment they'll be traveling to, and they'll be safe to step into the diving bell to begin their journey. The bell will be disconnected from the chamber, and they'll be lowered down to the deep sea worksite. This is all for safety and efficiency, so as to allow them to only have to decompress one time at the very end, and also to avoid decompression sickness, which is essentially excruciatingly painful bubbles that would form from the gas expanding in your body if you were to decompress too quickly. The saturation divers from the Wildrake were preparing something called a sound for transportation. The Thistle Sound, or Single Anchor Leg Mooring, is a $6.4 million tanker loading facility. It's pretty much just a massive 545-foot long oil container, which allowed them to transport oil back to land where an export pipeline didn't exist. From July through August, they had successfully reattached the buoy to the riser, and on this current day, August 7th, they were working to reattach the rest of the Sound to its base for transport. They were lowered down to a depth of 485 feet and began to work. It's to be noted that while they were being lowered into the ocean, the diving bell's transponder came loose. The transponder was then removed because the deck foreman had been ordered to cut it off. There were two divers down there, and after working for a while, one of them happened to look up towards the diving bell. The diving bell was hanging at an angle and something looked seriously wrong. This was because the bell had become completely disconnected from the lift wire. It was hanging at an angle because it was now being supported only by the umbilical cord and nothing else. The umbilical cord that supplied the heat to their suits, the power supply and communication to everyone above, and most importantly, the breathing gas that was keeping them alive. They're 485 feet down, floating in the dark and vast expanses of the ocean. They don't have a transponder, and this umbilical that they were now hanging by now served as the only thing that was keeping them connected to the ship. The only thing keeping them from being lost in the ocean. The diver that witnessed the issue reported the emergency and climbed back into the diving bell, sealing it shut. Once the ones above were aware, they began to try to solve the issue as quickly as possible. Back up on the Wildrake, the dive superintendent and dive supervisor were under the impression that the umbilical winch was the backup measure for bell recovery. They were unfortunately incorrect with their assumption. The same company that had certified the ship and its diving system did not certify the umbilical winch for bell recovery. They attempted to raise the bell by its already damaged umbilical, and their only lifeline got jammed in the winch while on its way up. Having failed down that avenue, they tried to raise the bell with the ship's crane. That sadly didn't work either. This secondary plan damaged the umbilical way more than it already was to begin with. So damaged it was to the point that power and hot water were now cut off from the divers entirely. Radio transmissions to and from the bell were now very faint, and it was decided that the bell would be lowered to the ocean floor while they figured out how to retrieve them. In the diving bell, they sat at a depth of 522 feet, and they did the only thing that they could do. They waited helplessly for people to come rescue them. Another diving vessel named Stena Wilder came along to assist. The plan that they had come up with was to have Stena Wilder's divers go down and attach a guide wire to the diving bell. Then they would use the wire to guide the Wildrake's crane hook down to the bell. Then all the rescue divers would have to do is connect it to the bell and they'd be pulled back up. It's now been roughly 4 hours since the problem was noticed. Stena Wilder's diving bell and its 2 divers begin their descent. Stena Wilder's diving system was undergoing repairs prior to all of this. It actually had to be ready just for this mission as quickly as possible, so not everything about the bell's condition was ideal. This is where all of the problems begin to come together. Each issue compounds on top of another, and things begin to get even worse. 1. The Wildrake bell doesn't have a transponder. 2. The Wildrake had moved the bell away from the sound base hours earlier. They had forgotten that they did that, so it wasn't in the location the rescue divers were expecting. And 3. Because of communication issues and the condition of the Stena Wilder's bell, the lights weren't working either. And because of all of that, by the time that they got down there, it took another hour to even find the Wildrake bell before they could even begin to attempt their plan. It's about 2 hours later from when the rescue divers began their descent. They find the bell and they see the 2 stranded divers giving them a thumbs up through the porthole. At the moment, everything seemed to be fine. At least as fine as it could be given the circumstances. To add to the mountain of issues they were dealing with, Stena Wilder wasn't a dynamic positioning vessel. Essentially, it didn't have a computer that would keep it in the same place. So the person that was above controlling it had to constantly manually adjust over and over to desperately attempt to stay in the same spot. Because of that, it took another hour for one of the rescue divers to even attach the guide wire. Their diving bell was attached to the unsteady ship, so while they were attempting their rescue plan, the bell was dragging the diver all over the ocean floor by their own umbilical. Once they succeeded, the Wildrake's crane hook began lowering. It's been about 7 hours since they first noticed the issue, and by now one of the rescue divers had noticed that the trapped ones had become very, very frantic. When the Wildrake's crane hook got down to the diver, it didn't go deep enough. They couldn't even reach the hook with the wire slings. The hook was raised back up to have more wire slings attached before it would be lowered back down again. A full hour after the guide wire was attached, the bell was finally connected and raised. The Wildrake didn't raise it vertically though. It was being raised at a 45-degree angle, and because they couldn't see 522 feet down, they also couldn't see how the bell was getting stuck against the sound as it was being raised. The wire sling snapped. The bell sank all the way back to the bottom, and before they knew it, the bell was lost again. They only realized this when the cable emerged with nothing connected to it. And by now it's been 10 hours since the initial problem occurred. When the divers found them again, they could see that they had tried to cut the ropes to the drop weights so that the bell would rise to the surface, but they had failed. Only one of the 2 weights had been removed. They could also see that the other divers were nearly dead at this point. After roughly 14 tiring hours trying to save them, the original 2 divers were at the point of exhaustion, and they were brought back up and were replaced by 2 other divers. Just after 19 hours from the first signs of the issue, they were taken out of the ocean and finally connected back to the Wildrake saturation system. They had somebody placed into saturation to check on the 2 divers, but it was already too late. Without having power or hot water circulation to the bell for that long, both of them had unfortunately died from hypothermia. It's to be noted that at a time before they were sent down, several changes were made to the diving bell. For starters, the swivel that connected the lift wire was replaced with shackles, which to my understanding means it probably wouldn't be able to pivot as well as it should. And I could be wrong, but that sounds like that contributed to why the wire broke in the first place. The clump weight was removed so the bell would be able to be sent over the side of the Wildrake rather than through the moon pool like usual. The clump weight can also be used to recover the bell in case something goes wrong. The bell's drop weights were tied to the side of the frame to prevent accidental releases. Accidental releases that had caused fatal diving accidents in the past. If installed correctly and unmodified, these drop weights can also be used to recover the bell in case of an emergency. Lastly, it didn't even have a bell stage. So let's say it was, somehow stranded on the bottom of the ocean floor one day, the bell stage would have prevented the hatch from becoming buried in the mud, which would have trapped them. There was just so much wrong with what happened. Not to mention that after the incident, during an investigation, inspectors found several safety violations aboard the Wildrake, evidence that heavily lean in the direction of negligence. How do I feel about this story? Honestly, I'm at a loss for words. Words from the sheriff involved in this case will sum up my emotions pretty accurately. He says that the removal of the clump weight played a part in why they aren't still alive today, and that the non-existent bell stage suggested that the diving contractors were more concerned with speed than with safety. He also states that the two divers could probably have been saved had the ones in charge investigated what was obstructing the bell before continuing. This was the story of the Wildrake diving accident. All of this was so preventable. Today we're going to be going through 3 disturbing stories. The first one is about diving, the second one is about caving and swimming, and the third story is about cave diving. They're all true, and they're all accidents. If you've been following this channel for a while, you'll know that most of the stories I cover usually take place quite a long time ago. On the other hand, this first one we're going to get into happened in Belgium only a few months ago, January 4th, 2024. This incident focuses on 2 divers that were originally from Liege, Belgium, but today they headed down to the Plate-Taille reservoir for a recreational nighttime dive. This was about 110 kilometers from their hometown. The 350-hectare Plate-Taille reservoir is just one of a chain of 5 artificial lakes, which make up the Wildrake lake complex. Together, these 5 lakes form Belgium's biggest lake chain. It has 5 dams distributed throughout the system, and it has its own hydroelectric power station. This area is also known as a popular scuba diving attraction, which is equipped with its own dive center. They started their dive at 5 p.m., at a time where the dive center was closed. It was said that the area that they were diving in was prohibited due to how close it was to the dam. Some believe they chose that time because they were well aware that they weren't supposed to be there. They were diving in a restricted area nearer to the hydroelectric power station, so some have speculated that they chose this later time because it would have likely meant there would be lower demand for the turbines positioned not far away from them. Well, they weren't that close, but what's considered not far away when something can create that much of a current? A current that you wouldn't be able to swim out of no matter how hard you tried. With a current like that, you likely want to be as far away from it as you possibly can be. That night, 2 of the 3 turbines had been running. Some of the comments online state that there isn't very much public information available to warn that turbines can come on at any time near to where people commonly dive. So even if they were aware that they weren't supposed to be diving there, they might not have been aware of the high chances of the extremely powerful turbines turning on while they were in the water. Because of the time, they might have assumed the chances of that were either very low or non-existent. Later on that night, one of the man's sons began to worry about the lack of contact with his father. Feeling nervous about all of this, he went down to where his dad was supposed to be. He would find his father's truck still sitting in the lake's parking lot, and the search would begin the next day. With the assistance of sonar, 10 divers would search for the men. That day, they would only find badly damaged equipment, and the next day they focused downstream of the dam. They would find body parts and remains of 2 individuals which forensic examination determined to be the 2 missing men. Based on the findings, authorities believe that they were diving in prohibited areas, swam too close to the dam's intake, and the powerful current dragged them into the turbine system. The intake tunnel begins at about 50 meters down and it can reach to a depth of 70 meters. Apparently, when you're in the water, you can hear the loud turbines working away in the background. Essentially, they were in the water at night. They began to feel an extremely strong current that they couldn't swim out of, even with the assistance of the dive scooters that they reportedly had with them. Against their power, they were pulled down into the cold darkness. They were sucked down into a massive long tube being bashed around as they hopelessly hurtled down inside of it. They were pulled deeper and deeper as they heard the sounds of the turbine increasing in volume until it was so unbearably loud that in an instant the sound came to a stop, as they ceased to hear or feel anything else at all. In Provo, Utah, sometime in August of 2005, 5 friends would hike their way up to Y Mountain to a cave that had some interesting qualities to it. The entrance looks like nothing more than a small dark hole camouflaged into the side of the mountain. Some locals know of the cave well. It's actually an old mine shaft with water flowing through it, which doesn't sound all that special, but the inside of the cave is where it gets interesting. The group began their hike at 3 a.m. and they reached the entrance of the cave at 4:30. This is where one of their friends decided they would sit this one out. They sat outside and watched as the other 4 began to crawl their way into the cave. Once inside the cave, they would travel about 50 to 90 feet until they would reach a fork in the cave that led into 2 different directions. The group had come all that way because the left side path had a unique water feature to it. They walked down the wet path until they found a small water-filled hole in the ground. This hole led to a long underwater tunnel. If you swam down and forward for 15 feet, you would find another hole directly above you. And when you emerge, you would be in a neat little pocket of cave that's said to be large enough to hold 8 people. The tunnel also had a rope lining the inside to guide you as you swam. The only things they would have to worry about is overcoming the fear of how dark and narrow the underwater tunnel was, whether or not they could stay calm in the freezing cold water, and how long they could all hold their breath. One by one, all 4 of them went down and began their swim. It seems as if they were all successful making the first trip, but on the way back, things didn't go according to plan. Fast forward, 45 minutes had passed. Their friend that was waiting on the outside for them to return started to realize that things weren't right. After calling a bunch of friends who were familiar with the cave, at 6:25 a.m., in a panic, they called the police. The water had become such a hazard that rescue crews had to pump water out of the cave before they could even begin searching. While they did this, they pumped fresh air back into the cave just in case the ones inside were running out of air. That is, if any one of them were still left alive. The rescuers weren't familiar with the cave, so as to not endanger themselves in the process, they had to move slowly and carefully. Because of this, it took almost 4 hours after the original call to even find anyone inside. And unfortunately, the first person that they found wasn't alive. The one that they found was submerged in the tunnel, and they'd soon find out that every other person was stuck behind them. The rescuers speculated that they had all drowned on the way back, because they were all facing the same way. Out of all the 4 people that were found in the tunnel, 2 were floating, 1 was on the ground, and the one in front seemed to have trapped the rest from escaping. Some people who've experienced the cave know that if you keep going past the hole by accident, a few feet past the exit, there's a dead end. I think it's safe to assume not everybody knows of that detail because you most likely have to have had a near-death experience to even know about it. Maybe that's what happened to the one blocking the exit. Maybe all they did was just swim a little too far, and before they knew it, their exit had seemingly disappeared, along with their life and the lives of the unknowing friends following behind them. The night before all of this, it's said that the group of friends had jokingly referred to the cave as the Cave of Death. If only that statement hadn't become a reality. May 26th, 2023, Jackson Blue Springs, Florida. Jackson Blue Springs is a stunning park where people can come to swim, hang out and enjoy the sun, and if you really wanted to, you could even go for some cave diving. The cave entrance there is 40 feet down, and it's estimated to be almost 28,000 feet in length. I couldn't find a more recent source, but by 2018 there was already 50,000 feet of explored tunnels and passageways. Some have even went as far as nearly 15,000 feet from the entrance during a single dive. It's needless to say that the cave is pretty massive. Given the proper training, beginners would do just fine in the earlier portions of the cave, but you better be an expert if you plan to go as far as some of those other divers. A man named Benjamin Strelnick would venture into the cave that day with his fellow friend and coworker. They did all their necessary pre-dive checks, made sure they were good to go, and began their dive down to the entrance. There's an obvious main passageway when exploring the cave, but there are many smaller chutes leading off in different directions all throughout. A lot of them aren't even marked on the map, so if you aren't careful, even with experience, it could be easy to get stuck in some of these tighter restrictions. To assist with navigation, guidelines line the cave leading off into different already surveyed sections. But don't let the safety of the guideline get you complacent. There's still many other things to watch out for as you explore any underwater cave. One of the main concerns, especially in a limestone cave like this, you don't want to touch any of the walls. Cave divers have to swim in a way that doesn't accidentally kick up any silt. This silt spreads around and creates a sheet that you can't see through. Your light would also reflect back off of it, making it even worse. Like driving in heavy fog with your high beams on, you wouldn't be able to see anything. Cave diving. It's a fun pastime, yes, and it doesn't need to be scary if you know what you're doing, but as a diver you always have to stay alert. Sometimes though, regardless of your experience or training, regardless of whether or not you made all of the correct decisions, sometimes things just don't go as planned. Ben was in front, and as they were swimming through the cave, he saw an interesting looking side tunnel that he wanted to explore. This tunnel wasn't all that far into the cave, and even though it had a guideline, it wasn't actually marked on the map. The passageway was pretty silted out. I don't know if it was the presence of the guideline that influenced his decision. Maybe it gave the illusion of safety, even with the silt. But he must have felt comfortable enough to go forward, because he entered the small area anyway, even though he couldn't see that far. Because of the low visibility, he didn't realize that the cave was actually closing in on him. It was getting narrower as he pushed himself forward, and he only realized once it was too late. He was now wedged in a small tunnel underwater. It was so small that he didn't have room to turn around, and the decisions of him and his partner are unknown. But what was clear is that Ben couldn't get out by himself, and there wasn't much that his partner could do to help either. After some time had passed, realizing nothing could be done, his partner sadly had to leave Ben there so they could go get help, and at the very least, save themselves. The police were called and they contacted Ed Sorensen for help in the rescue. Ed Sorensen is widely known in the diving community. He has helped and rescued many lost or trapped cave divers. He's made countless contributions to the safety of diving as a whole, and he is known for being one of the most experienced cave divers in the world. Sadly, when they finally got to Ben, he had already passed away. Ben was found with quite a lot of air left, but he was in such a tight restriction that some have the understanding that he wasn't able to reach the tank to be able to utilize it. The intense stress of the situation could have also caused such a panic that would have eventually led to him drowning. These theories are all just speculation. All we really know is that things went horribly wrong and Ben isn't here anymore. Referring to the dangers that surround the reality of scuba diving, here are some words that Ben once told his mother. "If I died diving, at least know that I died happy." This story I'm about to tell you takes place roughly 40 years ago, where one of the most horrific commercial diving accidents in history would unfold. November 5th, 1983, 4 a.m. In the Norwegian sector of the North Sea, the Byford Dolphin drilling rig continued to operate at its normal pace. Deep beneath the water's surface, 2 saturation divers would be continuing their shift as usual at the bottom of the ocean floor. Saturation divers are specialized commercial divers, whose tasks primarily range from underwater inspection to construction, repairs, and maintenance. These divers in particular had been working for more than 12 hours at this point, and they were coming to the end of their shift. So they finished up what they were doing and climbed back into their dive bell. Diving bells are strong chambers made to transport divers back and forth between the deep sea job site and the water's surface. It's essentially the same as you driving to work in your car, except their uniforms are diving suits, their mode of transport is the diving bell, and where they would arrive to clock in, depending on the time and depth, would be so deep underwater, so dark that if you didn't have a light, you wouldn't be able to see your hand in front of your own face. There are a few kinds of dive bells. The kind that they had was basically a big pressurized metal container with a cable that could pull them back up when they needed. Before we continue, I need to go over some crucial information to paint a better picture of the story, but we'll get back to those divers shortly. Now, because of the extremely hazardous depths they work in, they are required to breathe in a special gas mixture to prevent oxygen toxicity and the narcotic effects of nitrogen narcosis that follow. Breathing in normal oxygen past certain pressures is toxic to breathe. Inhaling this special gas mixture helps dilute the oxygen to a non-toxic and safe level. But in doing so, the dissolved gas begins to accumulate in the tissues. This is why divers have decompression stops before they return to the surface, so that through time they can safely eliminate these gases out of their system. These stops would differ in length depending on how deep and how long they've been submerged. If you were to surface too quickly without taking the appropriate stops, the gas wouldn't have time to clear from your blood properly. This gas has to go somewhere, and with it now being under less pressure, it would begin to expand, creating bubbles in your tissues and blood, settling in major joints like the knees and elbows. Decompression sickness, also known as the bends, are the 2 most well-known terms for this excruciatingly painful experience. In extreme cases, it can even take your life. For these reasons and many others, divers have to be very careful and calculated about every single detail when it comes to any dive. However, once the dissolved gases reach full saturation in a diver's tissues, and no more inert gas can be accumulated, the decompression time doesn't actually increase. The diver is now fully saturated. This is where we get the term saturation diving from. Saturation diving takes advantage of this by keeping divers in this saturated state, usually for up to weeks at a time. In most places, the standard being 28 days. This is so they can greatly reduce the time it would take to decompress. And once they're finally done, they would only have to be decompressed to the right pressure one time. For example, if a diver's tissues were completely saturated at a depth of 650 feet, it would take them about 8 full days of decompression to safely surface. Once you're fully saturated to a depth, whether the dive lasts 1 day or 12, the decompression time will ultimately be the same. So for safety and efficiency, this is why they're kept at this pressure for weeks at a time. Now that we've covered that vital information, let's get back to those divers. When they were finished their shift, they climbed back into the diving bell, and the hatch was closed so as to maintain the same pressure as they ascended. This pressure allowing them to avoid decompression stops for the time being. They were winched back up to the Byford Dolphin drilling rig where they would be able to connect their chamber to the living quarters. The living quarters were pressurized to 9 atmospheres as well, so that it would match the same pressure as the diving bell. The pressurized living area was comprised of 3 sections. When they arrived, the dive bell was attached to a trunk connecting to Chamber 1. In Chamber 2, there were 2 other divers resting on their beds, and Chamber 3 was currently unused. The connection to the trunk was kept sealed by a clamp, operated by 2 other experienced divers referred to as dive tenders. The divers that had just arrived left their wet equipment in the connection trunk, climbing their way into Chamber 1. The 2 divers controlling the clamp began their procedure. Every time they would lock down the connection, they would follow 5 steps. Number 1 would be closing the bell door, the door that was open to the trunk that led into Chamber 1. Number 2 would be to just slightly increase the pressure in the dive bell so that it would seal the bell door tightly. Number 3, close the door to Chamber 1, which led to the trunk and the dive bell. Step 4 would be to depressurize the trunk back to 1 atmosphere, essentially just back to normal pressure. And for the last step, open the clamp, separating the dive bell from the other chambers. If only that's what had happened. Unfortunately, not every step was made successfully. Step 1. Close the diving bell door. Step 2. Slightly increase the pressure in the diving bell. Step 3. Close the Chamber 1 door. Except, sadly, Step 5 had begun before Step 3 was completed. Step 5 was to disconnect the clamp. The first 2 steps were successful. At the time, it was believed one of the dive tenders controlling the clamp that was keeping the trunk sealed mistakenly opened it before the diver inside had a chance to close the chamber door. The result? Both chambers were subjected to explosive decompression. It went from 9 atmospheres of pressure to 1, faster than you could blink. Air rushed out of the chamber with such horrific force that it jammed the interior trunk door shut, the force violently pushing the dive bell away and striking the 2 dive tenders. Every diver on the inside wouldn't make it. They were gone instantly. Only 1 out of all 6 would survive, and the only survivor was severely injured. In the post-mortem examinations for 3 of the divers, it was stated that, with the rapid pressure difference, their blood boiled instantly, completely stopping their circulation on the spot. It read that there were large amounts of free fat in the cardiac chambers in the great vessels, as well as some other smaller vessels. Because of the instantaneous boiling of the blood, it led to what they referred to as fat precipitation. The rapidly expanding gases in their tissues had to go somewhere, and it did. Diver number 4 was standing closest to the door when it happened, presumably in the process of attempting to complete Step 3, closing the Chamber 1 door. He was absolutely mutilated as his body was forced out through a 24-inch space left by the partially jammed door. The post-mortem examination would also state, due to the expulsion of most of his organs, it suggested that part of him must have exploded. His body? Completely unrecognizable, pulverized and torn to shreds. Pieces and scraps of him everywhere. The trunk door was made with a center hinge. The door essentially rotated around its center on a vertical axis. In this case, the door had been rotated too far to one side, which left a crescent-shaped opening instead of sealing properly. The clamp could have been opened prematurely due to miscommunication. Maybe it was an order from their supervisor. Maybe due to some kind of confusion, they opened it through their own accord. They were working very long shifts. It could have just been fatigue. The rig and the sea were loud, and all they had to communicate was a bullhorn attached to the wall. Maybe they just misheard. Or maybe it was just gross negligence from the employer. The Byford Dolphin diving system was outdated. It didn't have failsafe hatches, exterior pressure gauges, or any mechanical preventative measure to stop the steps from being completed in the wrong order, or while the system was still under pressure. Related entities and former members of Byford Dolphin would claim the investigation was a cover-up. They would say that the ones in charge of the investigation didn't report on the disgusting exemptions made when it came to vital equipment needed for the crew. Vital equipment that could have prevented this disaster entirely. A lawsuit was later made by related parties of the profession and the families involved in the incident. They would push for further investigation, obtaining a crucial report by February 2008. For some time it had been suggested that it was one of the dive tenders' fault that this all happened. Many disagree with this. But this report indicated with proof that the real cause was faulty, outdated equipment. The families involved would eventually receive compensation for the damages, 26 years after that horrible day. The name of the only one that survived is 32-year-old Martin Saunders. Here are some quotes found from Martin Saunders after the incident. I was a bit further away when I decided to walk towards Crammond. When the blast occurred, I was approximately 1 meter away from the bell. Everything went black for a few seconds. Then I felt a combination of comfortable warmth and insane pain. My face was so messed up they didn't recognize me when they found me. They found me with my upper body partly under the 4-ton diving bell. For a moment they thought I was dead, so I tried to move my fingers so that they would see that I was still alive. When he got into the helicopter, he had noticed that his lungs had collapsed. I knew I had to keep breathing, or else I'm done. Crammond was lying next to me and passed in the helicopter on the way to the hospital. What has bothered me the most ever since it happened was, why was I the only survivor? I feel guilty. I feel like I've won the lottery. By cheating. 250 kilometers from Norway, in the Barents Sea, a seismic event would be picked up by multiple detectors around the world with a magnitude of 1.5 on the Richter scale. At 11:31 a.m., just over 2 minutes after the first event, a second would occur which measured up to 4.2 on the Richter scale. This was 250 times larger than the first. The second event was big enough to mimic that of the power of 3 to 7 tons of TNT, and it had happened 354 feet underwater. According to the coordinates and seismic data, the disturbance had taken place directly at the bottom of the ocean floor. The disturbance was so massive it was detected on sensors as far away as Alaska. This is the K-141 Kursk. It's an Oscar II class nuclear-powered cruise missile submarine of the Russian Navy. The name Kursk being presented to the submarine is a tribute to the Battle of Kursk in 1943, during World War II. Construction began in 1990 in the Soviet Navy military shipyards in Severodvinsk. During the building of the Kursk, the Soviet Union collapsed. Work would continue until the Kursk became one of the first Navy vessels to be completed after the collapse. The names Oscar Class 1 and 2, their NATO reporting names, refers to a series of 2 different nuclear-powered cruise missile submarine models. Oscar 1 class, Project 949 Granite, and Oscar 2 class, Project 949A Anti. The first submarine in Project 949 was built in the mid-1970s. The K-141 Kursk falls into the Oscar 2 class, with enhanced stealth capabilities, improvements and modifications to its hull design, and approximately 30 feet longer than its predecessor, the Oscar 1 class. This design represented the highest capabilities of Soviet nuclear submarine technology, and these models were the largest cruise missile submarines in service until 2007. It was built to be able to defeat an entire United States aircraft carrier group, both torpedoes and missiles capable of being equipped with nuclear warheads. A single Type 65 torpedo carried a 990-pound warhead which was powerful enough to sink an aircraft carrier. The outer hull was made of 8.5 millimeters of high nickel, high chromium stainless steel, which was covered in 3 inches of rubber. This gave it amazing resistance to corrosion and a weak magnetic signature, which helped immensely to stay hidden from magnetic anomaly detectors. The inner pressure hull had high-quality 50.8 millimeter thick steel. The interior was divided into 9 watertight compartments. It was designed to stay submerged for up to 120 days, and when it was time to come up, the sail's superstructure was reinforced to the point that it could break through the Arctic ice like it was nothing. It could be armed with 24 P-700 Granite cruise missiles and 18 Stallion anti-submarine missiles. The 8 torpedo tubes in the bow were interchangeable with either torpedoes or anti-ship missiles which had a range of 50 kilometers. The Granite missiles had a range of 550 kilometers, were capable of supersonic flight at altitudes over 20 kilometers, and were designed to swarm enemies, intelligently able to choose between individual targets. It was 509 feet long, which is roughly the size of two jumbo jets sitting next to each other. To put it lightly, it was an absolute nightmare. Long story short, the K-141 Kursk is no joke. It was seen as practically indestructible. It's said that Kursk could take a direct hit from a torpedo if it needed to. People thought of the Kursk submarine as unsinkable. Kursk was part of Russia's Northern Fleet. They were suffering funding issues back in the 1990s, so most of their submarines were sitting and rusting in the Zapadnaya Litsa naval base. The fleet's sailors were also unpaid during this period. The Kursk had only completed one mission during her 5 years of service by 1999. This meant that her crew had little hands-on experience and only a little more than 6 months at sea with the vessel. The crew of the Kursk would soon get more training though. An exercise named Summer X would take place on August 10th of 2000. This would be the first large-scale naval exercise for the Russian Navy in more than 10 years. The Summer X exercise included 30 ships, 3 to 4 attack submarines, and a group of smaller ships. Kursk had also recently won a citation for its great performance. It was recognized as having the best submarine crew in the Northern Fleet. Even though it was just a training exercise, the Kursk departed with tons of fully loaded combat weapons, being that it was one of the few vessels authorized to carry a combat load at all times. On the first day, Kursk successfully launched a Granite missile armed with a dummy warhead. All was working according to plan. On the second day, August 12th, Kursk was set to fire dummy torpedoes at the Kirov-class battlecruiser Pyotr Veliki. These were non-explosive and strictly for training purposes. Because of this, they were manufactured and tested at a substantially lower quality standard than that of real torpedoes. At 8:51 a.m. local time, the Kursk asked to proceed with the training launch of the 2 dummy torpedoes as planned. After getting confirmation, and after quite a long delay, at 11:29 a.m. the crew in the torpedo room began loading the first torpedo. It was a Type 65 kit torpedo nicknamed the Fat Girl. It had this name because it was 35 feet long and weighed almost 5 tons even without a warhead. 34 seconds after they began loading the dummy torpedo, a seismic event would be picked up by multiple detectors around the world with a magnitude of 1.5 on the Richter scale. At 11:31 a.m., just over 2 minutes after the first event, a second would occur which measured up to 4.2 on the Richter scale. This was 250 times larger than the first. The second event was big enough to mimic that of the power of 3 to 7 tons of TNT, and it had happened 354 feet underwater. According to the coordinates and seismic data, the disturbance had taken place directly at the bottom of the ocean floor. The disturbance was so massive it was detected on sensors as far away as Alaska. The crew from another Russian Navy submarine, the K-18 Karelia, detected an explosion. The captain assumed it was part of the exercise and no further action was taken. The crew of the Pyotr Veliki, being the target of the dummy torpedo launch, was much closer. They picked up a hydroacoustic anomaly similar to an explosion as well, and they felt their vessel shake in response. The crew, although initially unworried, still reported the event to fleet headquarters. But they were ignored. Kursk's schedule to complete their training was at 1:30 p.m. It's been 2 hours since the explosion and they still haven't heard from the crew of the submarine. There were frequent issues with communication equipment, so the lack of contact wasn't a cause for worry in the beginning. The crew of Pyotr Veliki called for a helicopter to look for the Kursk just in case. They were unable to locate the missing submarine. Captain Alexander Teslenko, the head of the fleet's search and rescue unit, was notified of the issue. He contacted the captain of their primary rescue ship and made sure it would be ready for departure in 1 hour. This ship, Mikhail Rudnitsky, was equipped with 2 AS-32 and AS-34 deep submergence rescue vehicles, or DSRVs for short, underwater cameras, a diving bell, lifting cranes, and a ton of other gear to aid in the search. At 5 p.m. an aircraft was sent out to look for the Kursk. They would search for 3 full hours, but unfortunately, no luck. At 6 p.m. Kursk had a scheduled communication check which they failed to meet. The Northern Fleet Command, obviously very concerned now, tried to contact the submarine multiple times. They never received an answer. At 6:30 p.m., they really began a search and rescue operation, sending out many more aircrafts to look for the Kursk. At 10:30 p.m., the situation was officially declared an emergency. The exercise was stopped, and roughly 20 vessels and 3,000 sailors began searching for the missing crew. Northern Fleet Commander Admiral Popov notified the Kremlin of what was taking place, but Minister of Defense Igor Sergeyev didn't notify President Putin until 7 a.m. Sunday the following day. On that same morning, Popov would downplay the events to reporters. He spoke about how successful the whole exercise was. He gave no sign that anything was wrong. Although that's what Popov said, rumors from the naval base that something wasn't right spread to the families of the Kursk crew quickly. The previous day, during the afternoon that the explosion happened, National Security Advisor Sandy Berger and Defense Secretary William Cohen were told that the Kursk had sunk. After being filled in on the situation, the British government, France, Germany, Israel, Italy, Norway, and the United States offered their help. The Russian government refused foreign assistance. The Russian Navy was adamant with reporters that the rescue would soon be a success. A very hopeful statement, yes, but those words couldn't have possibly been farther from the truth. On August 13th, 4:50 a.m., the crew of Pyotr Veliki discovered two large objects on the ocean floor that could potentially be the Kursk. At 9 a.m., the ship Mikhail Rudnitsky arrived at the coordinates. They set anchor at 11:30 a.m. and began preparing their AS-34 DSRV, which would enter the water at 5:30 p.m. About an hour later, at roughly 300 feet deep, they collided with something in the water. When the crew looked through the porthole, they saw the Kursk's propeller. Because of the damage done to the DSRV, they were forced to resurface, and they began preparing their other DSRV for transport. From 10:30 p.m. to 1 a.m., they searched for the Kursk once more, but due to miscommunication, they were unable to find it again. Pyotr Veliki attempted to contact Kursk another time, but no answer. When the salvage tug Nikolai Chikha arrived at the scene, they used their deep water cameras to get the first images. Images that nobody wished to see. The damage from the sub's bow to its sail was extreme. It was sitting almost sideways with its face angled down into the mud, and it had plowed so hard into the ground that it was buried 72 feet deep into the seabed. In the image, it showed that the periscope was also raised. This indicated that the first explosion took place at a depth of only 66 feet. Let's go back to August 12th when it all began. It's 11:29 a.m., and the crew in the torpedo room began loading the first torpedo. The Type 65 kit torpedo that they were loading had a dummy warhead, and although it was less dangerous, it still needed a fuel source to go anywhere. The propellant used for these torpedoes used high-test peroxide as an oxidizer, or HTP for short. HTP is essentially just an extremely concentrated version of the same hydrogen peroxide most of us have in our homes. If HTP were to come into contact with a catalyst, it would expand violently up to 5,000 times its initial size, creating tons of steam and oxygen in the process. While they were loading this 5-ton torpedo, it's believed that the HTP was leaking into other compartments through pre-existing faulty welds. It made contact with the catalyst, and the rapidly expanding HTP broke through the kerosene fuel tank, which set off an explosion equal to 220 to 550 pounds of TNT. Many things can act as a catalyst for HTP, but if there were faulty welds, all it would have taken is a little bit of dust, oil, or some types of metal to mix with the HTP to cause a reaction like this. The explosion that resulted from that immediately killed all 7 crew members in the torpedo room, creating a fire that burned up to 2,700 degrees Celsius, or 4,890 degrees Fahrenheit. Out of the 9 compartments, the torpedo room was in compartment 1 at the bow. The bulkhead between the first and second compartments would have stunted the explosion from going any further, but because of the powerful pressure difference that occurs during a weapon's launch, the valve that traversed the bulkhead was left open to minimize risk. This allowed the initial blast, the fire, and the toxic smoke access to as far as the 4th compartment. Because of this, the explosion wasn't minimized in the slightest. The crew in compartment 2, which was the control room, couldn't send a distress signal or even press the button for an emergency ballast tank blow, which would have brought the submarine to the surface. All 36 men in that room were either killed instantly or incapacitated to the point that they might as well have been. The Kursk had a rescue buoy in compartment 7 that would automatically deploy if it sensed fire or other conditions that mimicked an emergency. During the only other mission that the Kursk had been a part of in 1999, the rescue buoy had been disabled in fears of it malfunctioning and giving away their position, so it was unusable during this accident. Just a bit over 2 minutes after the first explosion, the spreading fire sets off a second one. the same ship that would have been receiving these dummy torpedoes. Through later analyzation of its acoustic data, it was found that the second explosion was from 7 completely live torpedo warheads rapidly exploding one after another. 78 crew members were usually in the first 4 compartments, leaving 49 to the last 5 compartments while it was submerged. This second explosion was so large that it blew a 22 square foot hole in the submarine's hull. This left the first 4 compartments open to the ocean. 90,000 liters of water per second poured in, and if anyone was left in these areas after the explosion, which is very unlikely, they would have been crushed as the 4 compartments collapsed under the immense pressure of the sea above them. Thankfully, the nuclear reactors that were on board were built to withstand very large impacts. They were fine after both explosions and they were able to shut down automatically, preventing what could have been an out-of-control nuclear meltdown. After the second explosion, the equivalent of 3 to 7 tons of TNT, 23 people still remained at the stern of the boat, in the 9th compartment, as what was left of the submarine began sinking to the bottom of the ocean floor. In emergency scenarios like these, crew members from the rear areas are supposed to move forward towards a rescue capsule that's found in the 3rd compartment, and if that didn't work, compartment 1 had an escape trunk. But due to the explosions, these compartments have completely imploded. As the fire slowly grew closer to the other compartments, it began to deplete the oxygen levels. Thankfully, the Kursk had chemical oxygen generators on board for emergencies. This model of oxygen generator in particular works by utilizing an inorganic compound named potassium superoxide. It absorbs carbon dioxide and releases oxygen via a chemical reaction. This reaction is also exothermic, and although rare, it poses a potential fire hazard. Though the most dangerous part about potassium superoxide is when it comes into contact with water. If, by some horrible chance, it came into contact with something like seawater, the potassium superoxide would begin to decompose into oxygen and potassium hydroxide. And unlike the other reaction that generates just oxygen, this different exothermic reaction is extremely violent, releasing an insane amount of heat. And if it comes into contact with a fuel source like, let's say, oil, it would create a flash fire, which would consume the rest of the remaining oxygen. That's unfortunately exactly what happened to the rest of the remaining 23 sailors. If that wasn't bad enough, the potassium hydroxide that would have been created from this reaction is extremely corrosive. These 23 men survived in the 9th compartment for 6 full hours. They passed around these oxygen generators to each other, taking turns so they could keep breathing. They were limited though, and they needed to be recharged with these potassium superoxide cartridges. Captain Lieutenant Kolesnikov and 2 others were trying to recharge one of these generators when they accidentally dropped one of the cartridges in the seawater that was slowly filling up the compartment. When the cartridge made contact with the oily water, it created a chemical explosion and an almost instantaneous flash fire. The potassium hydroxide that resulted from this reaction began burning the 3 that were closest, including Captain Lieutenant Kolesnikov, whose abdomen was so badly burned that his organs were exposed. The skin from his head and neck removed entirely from the blast. As the fire engulfed the cabin, some men were able to escape it by plunging underneath the water, which was now up to their waists. But now there was nowhere to go. There was fire creeping towards them from the other compartments, there was freezing cold seawater filling the rest of the sub, and when they resurfaced, the flash fire had eaten up the rest of the oxygen. So anybody that had survived quickly died of anoxia, meaning the rest either drowned or suffocated. On August 13th, the events were downplayed. They stated that the Kursk had minor technical difficulties. But on August 14th, Russia made its first official announcement. They spoke about how the Kursk had descended to the ocean floor, that they were in contact with the crew, and how they were pumping power and air to the submarine. They said that everyone on board is alive. Over the next 3 days, technological and mechanical issues prevented many attempts by the Russian Navy to attach its DSRVs to any of the hatches so they could see if anyone was still alive. Popov would make statements that suggested that there was no explosion and that the submarine was still intact. But shortly after those words were spoken, chunks of the inner and outer hulls would be found, and a 5-ton piece of the Kursk's nose nearby. 5 days after the accident, President Putin would accept British and Norwegian assistance. On August 20th, the Norwegian crew lowered a remotely operated vehicle which found that roughly the first 60 feet of the submarine was just a shredded and twisted mess. Arguments were had about what the Norwegian divers could and couldn't do, but the final agreement was that the divers could cut holes in the hull to gain access, but only Russian divers would enter the submarine. It was completely flooded other than a tiny bit of air, the oxygen percentage being so low that it wasn't breathable anyway. Ash and dust filled the inside of the first compartment. All of the men inside had been badly burned. Nobody was alive. After this news, on August 21st, Russian Northern Fleet Chief of Staff Mikhail Mutsak announced to the public that the Kursk had been flooded and that everyone on board had died. Northern Fleet Commander Admiral Popov also made a statement on TV, where at the end he removed his Navy beret and spoke the following words: "Forgive me for not bringing back your boys." On the 22nd of August, President Putin declared the 23rd of August a day of mourning. On the 26th of August, Putin awarded the title of the Hero of Russia to the submarine's commander, and the 117 crew members were awarded the Order of Courage. Russian residents criticized their government's handling of the situation, the public unrest overwhelming. During the rescue, because of the lack of information, families weren't able to confirm whether their own relatives were on the Kursk or not. None of them received official updates from the government until 5 days after the Kursk had already sunk. The Russian public was infuriated with the contradicting stories that they were told. The Russian media described the updates as totally unreliable, and their reaction to the disaster as technically inept. President Putin was almost immediately informed of the accident, but was told by his own navy that everything was under control. He was on a holiday in Sochi when he was made aware, but didn't end his trip for another 5 days. At the time, he was only 4 months into his presidency. His ratings dropped immediately, and the public and media were extremely upset with the way everything was handled. On August 22nd, now 10 days after the accident, Putin went to the Vidyevo Navy Base Officers Club and Cultural Center where he met almost 1,000 angry and grieving people, ranging from residents of the Navy base to family members of the crew that was lost. The tense meeting went on for about 3 to 6 hours. Here's a few statements from the people present that day to give you an idea of how it felt to be there. Do you believe our men are still alive? Why have you murdered our lads? When would the bodies of the submariners be brought home? When will we get them back, dead or alive? Who are you going to punish for their deaths, and how? At one point, Putin told the families that Admiral of the Fleet Vladimir Koroyedov agreed on accepting foreign assistance when it was offered on the 16th. He was promptly shouted down because the families already knew from media reports that help was offered 2 days prior on the 14th, contradicting his statement entirely. A grieving mother of one of the crew members interrupted the meeting. She said, "You better shoot yourselves now. We won't let you live, bastards." She was rightfully very emotional, but she wouldn't be quiet, so a nurse in civilian clothing came up from behind her, injected her with a sedative, and before she could react, she went quiet and was carried out like nothing happened. Supposedly, these moments were all captured by the TV crew, but it was heavily edited, and that part was never televised in Russia. Journalist Andrei Kolesnikov had been present during this meeting. 15 years later, in a documentary titled President, he would recount how it felt to be there. I honestly thought they would tear him apart. There was such a heavy atmosphere there, such a cloud of hatred and despair and pain. I never felt anything like it anywhere in my entire life. All the questions were aimed at this single man. During the meeting, President Putin blamed the oligarchs for the poor state of Russia's military. The oligarchs also own most of the country's non-government media, so he blamed that as well. He told the family members, "There are people in television today who, over the last 10 years, destroyed the very army and fleet where people are dying now. They stole money, they bought the media, and they're manipulating public opinion." When asked why there was such a slow reaction to accepting foreign assistance, Putin would state that the media was being dishonest. "They're lying, they're lying, they're lying." The next day, he would say similar things about the media during a speech to the public, that they were trying to exploit this misfortune to gain political capital. Fleet Admiral Vladimir Koroyedov stated that the accident had been caused by a collision with a NATO submarine. Commanders of the Russian Navy would repeat these claims for 2 years after the incident. There was no evidence provided to support these claims. United States Secretary of Defense William S. Cohen responded to Russian accusations of a collision with the submarine at a press conference in Tokyo on the 22nd of September 2000. Russians are suggesting that one of the possible reasons is a collision with a NATO or American submarine. They are asking to let them, well, have a look at a couple of United States submarines, and the answer from the American side is no. So I ask, why not? And what is your own explanation of that particular accident? Thank you. With respect to the Kursk, we had made it very clear that the United States, that our ships had no role in that terrible tragedy. We have communicated that. We believe that our word, indeed, has been categorical. I have received every assurance, and I know that all our ships are operational and could not possibly have been involved in any kind of contact with the Russian submarine. So frankly, there is no need for inspections. Since ours are completely operational, there was no contact whatsoever with the Kursk. I hope the Russian authorities find out the cause of it. All I can do is speculate at this point that there were internal blasts that led to the loss of that ship and the fine men aboard her. The final government report states that the officer who had approved the use of the HTP torpedoes didn't have the proper authority to issue such an order in the first place. The dummy torpedo that exploded was 10 years old, many of its parts exceeding their life cycle. Some people were aware that the torpedoes had been dropped during transport, potentially damaging it. And even a day before the exercise took place, the people that loaded these torpedoes took note that the rubber seals were leaking fuel. They even notified junior officers of the issue. But because of the importance of this mission to the Russian Navy, nothing was done regarding this information. And even with that knowledge, were loaded onto the submarine anyway. These practice torpedoes that were used had come from a batch of 10 made in 1990. 60% of them were rejected due to improper welding. One of the badly damaged torpedoes was later found in the salvage operation with heat distortion, the metal being torn apart very close to one of the most structurally important welds running along it. It was obvious what had happened. The investigation from the wreck of the Kursk had clear evidence that an explosion from one of the torpedoes had caused the chain of events. After the accident, a burnt copy of the safety instructions for loading HTP torpedoes was found. Except, this manual was for an entirely different type of torpedo, so it didn't contain essential steps that would have been vital to a user handling this type of torpedo. Families of the Kursk sailors were said to receive 10 years' salary, free housing in a Russian city of their choosing, free education for their children, and free counseling. While including donations from across the world, the families received roughly $35,000 US. Prosecutor General Vladimir Ustinov said that no charges would be filed, stating that it was a technical malfunction and blame could not be placed on specific people. During a news conference announcing their official conclusion, he would say that those who designed the torpedo couldn't foresee the possibility of its explosion. He would also say that there was no evidence that the torpedo had been damaged when it was loaded onto the Kursk. But on the 26th of July, 2002, he would announce that the hydrogen peroxide fuel in the dummy torpedo inside the fourth torpedo launcher set off the initial explosion that sank the Kursk. When discovering that Ustinov had closed the case without filing charges, many people were outraged. No one was blamed for the Kursk tragedy. No one was held accountable for the events that took place that day. And no one would see those 118 men alive ever again. Something has always piqued my interest about large bodies of water. Whether we're talking about the ocean, a lake, or a deep spring with unexplored caves, I always get the same eerie feeling when I think about being beneath the water's edge. Fear. But it doesn't seem right. Maybe fear isn't the only thing I'm feeling. Maybe more so, the mystery behind it. The fear of the unknown. Maybe the feeling comes from uncertainty. Or maybe it's the helplessness of being submerged in an element that we weren't designed for. Whatever it is, it makes me feel alert. It makes me feel alive, and I'm sure many can relate to that same feeling. A man named Ben McDaniel knew that feeling all too well, but unfortunately, that would be one of the last feelings he would ever experience. Vortex Spring, Florida, August 18th, 2010. As the sun went down, 30-year-old Ben McDaniel prepared his gear, planning to go diving for the second time that day. 2 days later, Ben McDaniel would be reported missing. Employees at the dive shop by Vortex Spring noticed that in the parking lot, Ben McDaniel's pickup truck was still there. It was busy enough in the summertime that the employees hadn't noticed how long his truck was sitting there for. Ben had been living in a beach house owned by his parents that wasn't far from the Vortex Spring. Recent life events had been affecting Ben heavily, so his parents suggested that he stay in the beach house as a way to take a break from life's stresses while they would support him financially. Not only had his brother passed 2 years prior from a stroke, which was later revealed to be a mistake, he actually passed because of an overdose, but he just had a divorce. His construction company had failed, and because of the failure he now owed $50,000 in tax debts. One of the ways he would distract himself from all of these stresses was diving. He'd been interested in diving since he was a teenager, so naturally he became a familiar face at the dive site. He lacked the required certification to safely enter the cave, so to get around that obstacle, he would explore the cave without bringing much attention to himself. The beginning of the cave at Vortex Spring would be found by descending 115 feet and swimming 300 feet onward until you would reach a rebar gate with a chain and lock. At the entrance, you would see a sign with a picture of the Grim Reaper. Beside that were many facts warning you of the dangers that lie ahead. Through the gate, the mapped part of the cave went as far as 1,600 feet onward, down to a depth of 310 feet, although the entirety of the cave's real size is unknown. Only the most experienced divers would enter the cave because of precautions put in place due to many previous accidents and passings. The key to the locked gate would only be given to divers who provided their proper certification, a certification that required extensive training and experience to complete. The dive itself was so difficult that at certain sections divers would actually have to remove their tanks as they pushed them forward in front of themselves. Some of the areas would narrow down to only 10 inches of room. Ben would go there often enough that other regulars and employees came to know of him. One employee once stated that although Ben was very knowledgeable of diving and seemed to have all the proper equipment, he would come across as overly confident about his cave diving abilities. His father later stated in 2014 through an online comment that Ben couldn't find anyone at the spring willing to be his diving partner, and because of this, he would do his dive solo. His father would later say, Ben was brave. Ben was fearless. He followed his passions. August 18th, 2010. Ben would make his first dive in the middle of the day. Divers in the area would state that he was looking closely around the cave entrance, as if he was planning for something. Once he finished his first dive, he would fill up his tanks at the dive shop and spend the rest of the afternoon near the spring by himself, testing equipment and making notes for his dive log. Later on, he would prepare for another dive, and once the sun was setting, he would go back in the water. Employees that were on their way back from their own dive saw Ben with his helmet and lights on. The gear he had on suggested he intended to go into the cave. One of the employees had the impression for some time that Ben had been forcing the gate open. Assuming that's where he was going, the employee went down to him and unlocked the gate. He watched as Ben went inside the cave and returned to his colleagues. That was the last known time that anybody would see Ben again. During the search for Ben, they would find his belongings in his truck. None of his diving equipment was present, other than the dive log showing that he had explored the Vortex Spring cave before. There weren't any signs of struggle around anywhere he would have been. They even found his dog at the beach house who hadn't been fed for a few days, and everybody assumed he had drowned in the cave trying to find his way out. Cadaver dogs were taken around the area, and they would alert towards the water's surface. News had spread about Ben's disappearance, and although it had a lot of attention, there were only a small amount of divers on the planet that held the necessary training and skill to even attempt a search like this. Experienced divers carefully combed the cave for smaller areas he may have crammed himself into in an attempt to find his way out in his low-oxygen panic. He wouldn't be found. Many divers continued the dangerous search for Ben over the weekend, but to no avail. One of the divers stated that they had almost died trying to find him. 2 of Ben's tanks were found near the entrance of the cave. This didn't add up because divers usually place air tanks throughout the route needed for decompression on the way back, not just at the entrance. Ben had been researching cave diving and was aware of the proper gas mixture you would need for a dive at that depth. Yet when his tanks were tested, they were only filled with normal air. Compressed air is fine for a while, but after a depth of 30 to 50 meters, a gas mixture is needed to reduce the risk of nitrogen narcosis. Nitrogen narcosis is caused by inhaling compressed inert gas, which causes a change in consciousness, creating an anesthetic-like effect. Symptoms range from poor judgment and disorientation to trouble concentrating, and in extreme situations, even hallucinations. There was one more tank found another 200 feet inside the cave, but this one was filled with normal air also. It didn't make sense. 2 days after the acknowledgement of Ben's disappearance, Ed Sorensen was contacted. Ed Sorensen is a cave diving recovery specialist with roughly 2,500 log dives. Other divers warned him of the danger and urged him not to go deeper into the cave, but he insisted. Using a diving propulsion vehicle and smaller tanks, he became capable of making it farther than other divers were able to, even farther into the cave than Ben had originally mapped out. There weren't any marks on the cave walls, not even disturbed silt floating around. He found no evidence of Ben anywhere. It didn't even look like he'd been through the cave. Something to be noted is that Ben was taller and bigger than Ed too. Ed stated that without cave diving training, there wasn't a way Ben could have made it through the narrow passages. He continued by saying, "I know what I'm doing, and I barely made it through." Many more efforts were made by the family and others to search the cave further. In total, there were 16 divers who spent 36 days back to back looking for Ben's body in the cave. Nobody found anything. Many tests of the water over months showed no increases in bacteria either. Bacteria that would indicate any traces of decomposition. Some people wondered if his body was even in the cave to begin with. Maybe it washed out through one of the spring's outflows. Maybe his body was removed before the search began. Other theories suggested that he faked his own disappearance to escape his life stresses. The McDaniels were certain he wouldn't have faked this though, highly doubting he would purposely leave his girlfriend and dog behind, knowing how it would subject them and their family to so much grief. The McDaniels offered a reward of $10,000 to anyone who was brave enough to find Ben, under the impression that Ben's body was in a place no one had reached yet. The use of the word brave in the McDaniels' offer rightfully upset the divers that had already risked their lives trying to find Ben, worrying that this would provoke less experienced divers to put themselves at further risk. Regardless, the McDaniels would increase the reward up to $30,000 by March 2012. One diver named Larry Higginbotham justified the worries of the other divers, drowning before he reached the exit on his way back out. Following mounting pressure and criticism, the McDaniels retracted their reward. Another point of interest brings us to a man named Lowell Kelly. He had owned Vortex Springs since 2007. At one point he said an employee owed him thousands, and allegedly took them out to a remote forested area where he would beat them with a baseball bat in an attempt to make them pay up. The man escaped, and Kelly was initially charged with assault and kidnapping, but the final charges against him would only lead him to be fined and to serve 7 years probation. He would pass before the first year was finished. During an event at Vortex Spring, it was said that Kelly fell down the stairs, injuring his head. A guest drove him home and did what they could, but by the morning when somebody else came to check on him, his condition had only worsened. Emergency services were called. He was admitted to the hospital, and he would live in a comatose state until he passed the following month. The lead agency investigating Ben's disappearance made implications that they hadn't gotten the full story of what happened to Kelly that night. The individuals that last saw Kelly wouldn't be named either, and suspiciously, the autopsy report wouldn't be released because they claimed it would compromise an ongoing investigation. The McDaniels began wondering if all of this was leading to the idea of foul play. Was his diving disappearance staged to cover up what really happened? Did the dive shop staff discover him already? Did they relocate his body in fear of the consequences of finding him? These are the questions that many have asked, but nobody knows. Not knowing where else to turn, the family hired a private investigator. She discovered that other people related to Vortex Spring had criminal records as well as Kelly. The investigator would say that there is just as much reason to look above the water for Ben's body as there was to look below it in the cave. With no progress being made down any avenue, the cadaver dogs would search the area around the springs once again, but without any luck. He would never be found. This whole story is just unnerving. No matter how you piece it together, nothing ever quite fully adds up. What happened to Ben McDaniel? Why did he disappear? Where is his body? Was his body ever in the cave during the time of the search to begin with? Is he still there? Given how extensive the search was, where could he be if he isn't in the cave? It's almost been 14 years since this all happened. It only begs the question, will anybody ever know the answers? Cave diving. A scary idea to most, but to some it's a thrilling pastime. Whether it be the adventure of exploring, or the physical and mental challenge, or the great community and the people you befriend along the way, the divers that choose to do it will tell you it's an experience like no other. But it's not all fun and games. Although it may be an amazing experience to some, there are always dangers lurking within diving. Dangers that leave very little room for mistakes, where even the slightest of miscalculations could mean the difference between you resurfacing to safety or you tragically taking your last breath, floating below reach of any chance of survival. Today's story will be about how a group's innocent adventure to a beautiful cave turned into a nightmare gone horribly wrong. The cave's discovery is fascinating. It's honestly amazing that it was ever found to begin with. In 1938, in southern Australia, on a farm just a few kilometers from Mount Gambier, a farmer noticed one of his horses suddenly stumble when crossing a part of the field. When the farmer went to investigate why the horse was having trouble, they noticed a hole in the ground that was about a foot wide right where the horse had tripped. Looking through the hole, they could see that they had discovered something huge right underneath their feet. No other signs existed above ground to suggest such a massive cave could be hiding in plain sight. Imagine a long, flat, grassy field, but right below the ground lies a water-filled cave that's 407 feet deep. It's 460 feet long, and its width is 260 feet. If the horse or the farmer somehow fell through the hole, they would have fallen a whole 23 feet until they hit the water. And the top of the cave widens out like a triangle, so had anybody accidentally fallen in, they wouldn't have even had a way out. Over years and years, these types of underground caves are formed by certain types of rocks slowly dissolving away from heavy rainfall. The porous limestone that this cave was formed from created stunning internal structures, with beautiful clear water so you could see every detail. The cave eventually became famous with divers for its visual appeal. More than 3 decades later in 1973, on the 26th of May, a group of 9 divers departed to make their way to this huge underwater cave. By now, this cave was well known amongst divers, receiving the title, The Shaft. It's called the shaft because of the small hold entrance, and the shape that's created by the light that funnels through it and into the deep water on a sunny day. Over the years, the hole had been widened to 3 feet for better access. Because of the 23-foot drop to the water, divers and equipment are lowered down to the water in several trips by a rope system similar to a pulley, attached to a metal structure directly above the hole. The day prior to the main dive, the group would lower themselves down into the hole to establish a shot line. A shot line is a rope attached to a float on the surface, which has a weight attached to the submerged other end so it keeps it in place. It's used for many things, but it's essentially a helpful safety precaution to aid divers in their decompression stops, and to act as a guide from the diving spot to the surface so you don't get lost along the way. Shot lines are good for safety, visibility, travel, and efficiency. And when it comes to diving, obviously you don't want to do anything too fast, but efficiency and accuracy is key to keeping everybody safe. There is a large pile of limestone roughly 130 feet below the sinkhole's entrance. This is called the rock pile, and it's where they established their shot line. They explored just around the edges of the rock pile for a short time before returning to the surface and finishing up for the day. The very next day, May 28th, they would all return to explore the cave even further. One diver would decide not to dive that day and stay at the top to help the team in other ways. Past the rock pile, there are 2 tunnels that extend downwards in different directions. One side reaches to a depth of 260 feet, and the other extending to 407 feet. Further access is blocked by rocks, and the extent of the cave's true size is unknown. One side of the sloping section of the chamber is called the Edge. It's a very narrow and dark section where the light from the shaft won't reach. Without another light, it's pitch black down there. They didn't plan exploring past the Edge. The rock pile is considered to be the only real safe area of the dive, but even at that depth, they could have already been experiencing heavy signs of nitrogen narcosis. I assume most of you already know what nitrogen narcosis is, but let me briefly and quickly explain for those that are unaware. Nitrogen narcosis is something that happens to divers when they breathe in their gas mixtures past certain depths. Past certain pressures, it essentially becomes toxic to breathe. It affects your judgment, memory, and concentration, among many other things. It would basically feel like you were drunk underwater, but worse. And in extreme cases, you can even hallucinate. It's said to be pretty terrifying, and as a diver, you want to avoid it at all costs. So since they could have already been feeling the effects pretty heavily at the rock pile, anywhere below that depth would just be increasingly worse, until the effects would be extreme. The rest of the cave around and below the rock pile were either unexplored, pitch black, or covered with loose floating silt from the limestone, which would completely blind divers if they were stuck in it. Light or not, you wouldn't be able to see where you were going if you were stuck in it. If you explored to the deepest depths of this cave and you didn't have helium in your breathing mixture to dilute the gases, the effects of nitrogen narcosis would be extreme and unimaginable. They had never planned to dive that deep though. Unfortunately, they didn't plan as much as they should have. All 8 divers that went down that day ignored several key safety principles. To start off, the shot line didn't even reach the floor, so it could potentially move around from its intended spot. It also didn't have extra air tanks attached like it was supposed to have. They didn't calculate properly or plan out their gas mixture, gas amounts, or decompression times. They didn't organize for diving partners as a failsafe, which is very, very important. And they weren't exploring with a safety line either. This would assist in leading them back in case anything went wrong. For a while, they all explored, but at the edge of the rock pile, at a depth of 180 feet, Diver 1 was beginning to feel the effects of nitrogen narcosis already. He signaled to everyone else that he would be making his way back to the top of the rock pile. Everybody signaled back that they would be exploring some more. Diver 1 stayed by the rock pile for about 8 minutes waiting for his friends to return. Diver 2 began making his way back up. He knew with the amount of air that he had that he was cutting it close. Before going back up, Diver 2 went to tap Diver 3 to let her know that there was no more time to keep diving, but she had swam away before he was able to notify her. Divers 1 and 2 resurfaced at the same time to see that Diver 4 had already finished his dive. 30 seconds later, Diver 5 would pop their head out of the water, and Diver 5 had barely any air left in their tank when they surfaced. Aware of how low their oxygen would have been and how serious the situation had become, Diver 2 got an extra air tank and went back into the water as quickly as he could to look for the other 4 divers. At around 225 feet, he got to the edge of the underwater cliff and found Diver 6's light and camera, but Diver 6 was nowhere to be seen. When he looked up, all he could see ahead was tons of silt floating around in the water, making it impossible to see or navigate any further into the cave. There was nothing he could do, and he had to resurface. Diver 5 went back down as well to try to find them, but nobody was found and there was nothing they could do. The 4 other divers were gone, and they never resurfaced alive. The 4 surviving divers would state that they saw Diver 3 and Diver 7 attempting to get back to the rock pile as quickly as they could. In their panic, they swam directly upwards instead of following the slanted rock that they had initially descended down. They thought they were swimming up towards safety, but unknowingly they were actually swimming up into a dome-like structure in the ceiling that didn't have an exit. Diver 4 would say that before he had surfaced, he saw them in the distance and they looked frightened. Diver 3 and Diver 7 had low visibility due to the silt, low oxygen, and they drowned trying to escape the dome they had mistakenly swam into, while most likely also experiencing a nitrogen narcosis-induced panic. One other survivor would say that he saw someone swimming with lots of effort further down into the cave, swimming towards a dead end where there was no exit. The person he saw was diver number 8, and at that depth he was probably suffering from the more extreme symptoms of nitrogen narcosis, and in his severely disoriented state was sadly unable to understand that he was actually swimming to his own demise. Many recovery dives were made over the following year. Some were failures, some were successful, but every dive seemed to bring on more challenges than the last, and it was an extremely difficult recovery operation. January 23rd, 1974, Diver 6, the one who had lost their light and camera by the edge of the cliff, was found at a depth of only 50 feet, floating under a ledge against the ceiling. March 9th, 1974, Diver 3 and Diver 7 were found together at a depth of 185 feet, and Diver 8 was first seen 20 feet lower. It would take until April 9th, 1974 for the last body to be recovered. To really put in perspective the extent of the unwelcome environment that these divers were faced with, and why everything needs to go perfectly according to plan, the recovery operation to retrieve the bodies took almost an entire year since the incident happened to complete successfully. Diving can be an amazing and fun pastime, but if things go wrong, it can be absolutely terrifying. That's going to be it for today. Hopefully you found it interesting. Hopefully you learned something. But before you all go, I just want to give a big shout out and a thank you to DiveDB for allowing me to use the shaft footage. They have a website called divedb.net that will be posted in the description. They take tons of photos on their dives. There's tons of wildlife pictures to look at and crazy beautiful sights to see. If you have time, go check them out. It's seriously amazing what they do. And if you made it this far, thank you so much for watching. Hit like and subscribe if you haven't already, and I hope you have a good rest of your day or night depending on where you are. Until next time, take care.